back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hey guys, I'm here today to do a joint book review of two books that I recently read, both of which are part of the Gallant's science fiction and fantasy masterworks ranges. The first one is The Female Man, which is by Joanna Russ, and this is part of the science fiction masterworks. And the second one is this one, The Riddle-master's Game, which is by Patricia A. McKillip, and this is part of the fantasy masterworks. So I'm going to start off with this one because I didn't love this one, guys. It's quite a long book, and it's actually 3 books in one, so it's an omnibus edition. And the collection itself is called The Riddle-master's Game, but the books within this are The Riddle-master of Head, Heir of Sea and Fire, and Harpist in the Wind. I wanted to love this because I really enjoyed Patricia A. McKillip's short story collection I read quite a long time ago, I think a couple of months. And I definitely enjoyed that. I thought she was a really fun writer. She did sort of classic fantasy with some modern twists, and this book just didn't have that. I don't know if it's because it's an earlier work by her and maybe she's developed since then, or if it's just that I just didn't get on with this one. But basically this story just annoyed me, if I'm honest. It just annoyed me because it was so predictable. And I didn't like it very much, and I know loads of people love this series, so I was a little bit worried that I didn't love it, but it just didn't gel with me. And I'm definitely not against trying more of her books, I certainly will, but this particular story and series, no, it just wasn't for me, which was a real shame considering there's lots of elements I did like, but the story itself just did not come together for me. So, what is this about? This is the story of Morgon, who is the Prince of Head. We follow his story from the beginning, and he is someone who's quite adventurous, he likes a challenge, and he likes a riddle, and riddles in this world are a very important part of society. They are kind of magically infused riddles sometimes. So riddling and riddle mastery is definitely a prominent theme in this whole world, and Head is a fairly small village, kind of farmer county, that sort of thing. They do lots of farming there. They don't really get involved in political intrigue and problems that often, so it's a bit unusual that he would be the one who goes off and solves a riddle, but he does, and he does a very impressive amount of riddling, and he manages to solve a riddle, which means he can then claim the hand of a princess. And so he solves this riddle, he goes off to try and claim the hand of this princess, and along the way his ship sinks because it has been attacked, and he loses his memory, and he ends up going to a completely different part of the world and trying to reclaim his memories, find out where he came from and what his mission in life is, and realises that he is destined for a lot more than he ever bargained on, thanks to this riddle. Now that sounds fairly cool, but the problem I had with this story, particularly the first and third sections, was it was really, really slow, and a lot of it was quite boring. And I don't often say that fantasy's boring. I don't mind long descriptive paragraphs, I don't mind lots of walking around, unless it's boring to me, and in this book it just didn't captivate me, it didn't draw me in, and it didn't really intrigue me. So the first story and the third story, I actually listened to all 3 on audio, but the first and the third mainly focus on Morgon himself, and they are narrated by a different narrator, a male narrator, and the narrator was alright and the story was okay, but it was just that, it was nothing more. The first book kind of sets up the world, and you don't really get a huge amount of plot besides that. It's only at the very end of the first book that you sort of start to see the magics of this world, which is shape-shifting. That's pretty cool, and the fact that music and harping has a big role to play. These 3 stars on the cover also have a pretty big role to play in the story, because they mark out the one who is chosen, who of course is Morgon. No spoilers there, that's pretty obvious. So yeah, generally it's got potential, but it just never got there for me. So the first book was very much a set-up story. The second one actually focuses on a different character who is the princess that he is destined to marry, and this story I enjoyed a lot more, not only because the narrator was different, but the viewpoint itself was different, and I found that the viewpoint of the princess was something I could connect to a lot more. She seemed a much more relatable character, someone who was a bit more rational and a bit more get up and go, and didn't just let things happen to her or just sort of plod through life. She was quite happy to get up and be someone herself and make sure that she was getting things done. And I feel like Morgan never really got into that. He was very much kind of letting things happen, just drifting through life and plodding from place to place. And I just didn't care for it. So I think the switch in narrative voice and the switch in character meant the second book was a lot stronger for me. But then the third book came along, and the third book, they are both in as viewpoint characters, and by this point they've fallen in love, which is kind of stereotypical, but we'll take it. And I just didn't like it because I felt like the character that I'd come to love and know in the second book was just ruined in the third book, and she was such a minor character compared to Morgan, and she didn't really live up to what she had been expecting to do in the first and second books particularly. And I just felt like she betrayed herself in this third book and she didn't really do anything. And then Morgan himself is just really whiny. I just don't like him. Constantly whining, he's constantly angry and annoyed with people, he's constantly trying not to release his inner rages on people, and I just don't like him. I just didn't care about his plight and his struggle. I was much more interested in the princess, and I was much more interested in her story, and that all went wayward, and I just sighed in frustration. So I gave the first book and the third book a 2 stars, I gave the second one I think a 2.5 or 3, and overall this just was not a great series for me, and it's certainly not one I would strongly recommend. I would love to hear your thoughts on it if you have read it and enjoyed it, why you did. Maybe it was an early fantasy read for you and you hadn't read lots of other fantasy, or maybe it just holds a special place in your heart, I don't know. But for me, this just did not live up to some of the fantasy I've read, and it really, really let me down in character development and plot building. The only thing that I think was somewhat interesting was the magic, and there wasn't a huge amount of that. So yeah, I did not like this really, guys, I'm afraid. So that's my review on that. But, moving on, plus side, is that the second book I have to review, The Female Man, I definitely enjoyed a whole lot more. I read this book with Amanda, I'll link her channel below, and we definitely enjoyed discussing this book. It's certainly a book that merits a lot of discussion. It follows 3 main characters who all have names that begin with J, and they all kind of live very different lives because one of them is quite quiet, quite simple, she kind of just gets things done. Another one comes from a planet where there are no men and she is very independent, she's very able to do things for herself because obviously the men aren't there. And we also follow a sort of third character who's kind of narrating things, and we do get a 4th introductory character later on as well. And these 3 women are called Joanna, Janine and Janet, and we know that Joanna's world is kind of like our world. Janine's world is kind of a alternative world to ours because the Second World War never happened and the Great Depression is still going on and inequality is still quite rampant. And then the third one is Janet's world, which is While Away, and While Away is actually a planet that has no men whatsoever on it, and therefore it's just populated by women and they can reproduce themselves, they don't need men at all. So yeah, it's definitely a really interesting concept, and these 3 women, for various reasons, kind of intersect in their lives, and their worldview is very different and quite challenged by the other women that they meet because they all come from such different lifestyles. However, they're all quite similar in their views and their particular personalities, so it's a really interesting look at these different cultures they come from and how they would clash and mix if they were to meet in real life. As the story goes on, you do see that there are some science fiction elements, clash of cultures and alternate worlds, but generally I would say this is much more of a feminist text than it is a science fiction. It's a lot about equality and inequality, it's a lot about misogyny and how men control society, or in the case of While Away, women, how they control their society. It kind of compares and contrasts the inequality on Earth with the different cultures and the different way that While Away is run. It's really quite a dark read at some points because there are some moments where it's very much insinuated that men are trying to get to these women in order to use them as sexual objects, and it definitely has that darker tone to it in places. But overall I think it's more of a discussion than it is anything else, and it really does discuss feminism and why inequality should not be something that is allowed anymore. in a really interesting way, and I really enjoyed the discussions behind this story more than anything. As a plot, as a narrative, I didn't think it was that impressive. I think it was quite predictable what was going to happen at the end. But as a discussion and as something to sit down and talk to your friends or family about, it's certainly something that is well worth reading. And I definitely enjoyed this a lot more. So I ended up giving this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and it's something that I will certainly think about more than the other stories I've read, even if I didn't love it for the plot. So I would say that's a good rating overall. Definitely better to end on a much higher note than I began on with this one. So I'd love to hear down below if you've read either of these, what you thought of them. I've read books before by both of these authors and enjoyed both of their previous books I'd read, so I was hopeful I'd like both, but obviously that's not always the case. This one just didn't work for me and this one did. Do let me know down in the comments whether you've read them, what you thought of them, and if you will be picking them up if you've not read them before. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you very soon in another video. Bye!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.